started. So hi, everybody. Welcome to the second virtual panel for Hats Off for Headwaters 2022, which is our annual fundraiser here at Colorado Headwaters Land Trust in Grand County. This panel, the second panel of this week, is usually reserved for conservation easement landowners. So we can hear from the landowners, both those who granted the original easement, as well as landowners who purchased properties already conserved. Due to some circumstances this year, tonight's panel is going to be more educational and more of a roundtable. We have a number of people here attending, both on camera and off. And my intention is to spend the next 45 minutes to an hour talking about conservation easements and land trusts and conservation in general, specifically in Colorado, although we can talk on broader terms if we'd like. Really, mainly because a lot of people have a lot of questions about conservation easements. There are some myths out there, there's some misconceptions, there's some pretty wild disagreements. And so hopefully tonight we can address some of those questions and clear the air for a lot of folks. Hats Off for Headwaters is this week. It started on Monday and goes until Sunday, the September 18th. On the 18th is our in-person celebration outside of Fraser. Tickets are still available. So if you go to our website, coloradoheadwaterslandtrust.org, all spelled out, all one big word, you can find more information. You can find out about the in-person event, buy tickets there, as well as see our silent auction. Our silent auction goes all week. It's online on HandBid. And on Sunday at the event, the silent auction will still be there, as well as a live auction. We'll have presentations. You'll get to meet board members and staff members and a lot of others from the Fraser Valley area and all of Grand County, gathering around conservation. As our vision states, we envision an inclusive conservation community in Grand County dedicated to the protection of the land. Pretty straightforward, and I think something everyone can agree. So the auction is ongoing. The in-person event tomorrow is our third and final virtual panel of the week, which is with Land Trust Board and staff. That one, like tonight, is more educational. Tomorrow with board and staff, we'll be getting to know your land trust. We can answer questions about conservation, but it'll mainly be a conversation between myself as moderator and the board and staff members attending, to see how they got involved with the land trust, kind of their guiding philosophies around conservation, and just so you know who you're supporting when you support us. So we'll get started with an overview, or actually we'll get started by asking, Lee is already on video. If anyone would like to be on video, you're welcome to, since this is more of a roundtable evening. You don't have to. You can unmute and raise your hand or comment questions throughout the next hour or so. So we'll start with just some basic definitions to get the ball rolling. Colorado Headwaters Land Trust is a land trust. Land trust is generally a private 501c3 or a third party, so neither a private individual nor a governmental entity, whose mission is in some essence conservation. Most land trusts in the country use conservation easements as their main tool of conservation. A conservation easement is a voluntary legal tool to conserve real property. So that means if anyone here has purchased property, you go to the title company on closing, you sign all those documents that no one ever reads. A bunch of those documents are rights. They give you rights to do with what you will on your land. Two of those rights are subdivision and development, the right to divide your land and the right to develop your land. Those two are at the corner of, or at the intersection of owning real property and developing it, making whether it's a new house or a strip mall or a highway or anything else. A conservation easement, at least the way that Colorado Headwaters Land Trust practices, as well as many other land trusts in the state of Colorado, is a conservation easement grants or transfers at least the development and subdivision rights from the private landowner to the third party organization. This does not mean that the private landowner is relinquishing their land. They're not even relinquishing their ability on the land. What they're doing is making a long-term perpetual confirmation of conservation on their land. Just as paving is a fairly permanent activity on the land, right? Deciding to build a building is making decisions for every landowner down the road. So too is conserving it by disallowing the paving, by disallowing the development. Colorado Headwaters Land Trust started in 1995, and over the last 27, 28 years, we have been granted 66 conservation easements, totaling 9,310 acres. And these conservation easements range from very small ones. We have one that is less than an acre in the town of Grand Lake. And then our largest conservation easement is 1,000 acres just south of Granby. Most of our conservation easements are in the, call it 100 to 200 acre range. And about a third of them are agricultural. So working cattle ranches, working crop farms, some fashion, they are ag properties. But we have ranchettes, we have individual homes. Conservation easements are not inherently limited to the practice of the land. Conservation easements are utilized in different ways. So I described the way that Colorado Headwaters Land Trust utilizes them. We do not own land. We don't manage land. We are a monitoring organization. We are here to allow landowners to make that confirmation of conservation for their property and for their legacy. There are other land trusts, some in Colorado, but it's more prevalent on the East Coast for land trusts to actually own properties that they conserve. That's ones that come to mind are Tennessee and Kentucky and Georgia. A lot of those land trusts, not all of them, a lot of them will work to purchase the land outright. Whether they keep it in agricultural practice or they turn it into a park or they keep it wild or they do something else with it is variable. But there are multiple ways to conserve property. So I'll stop there. And if there are any questions, I welcome them. Any clarifications, or if you want me to dive into something I've said over the last 10 minutes or so, you are welcome to. Okay, well, I'll keep going. So with conservation easements, there are, and more recently in the last year or so, there have been a number of myths and a lot of misconceptions on the national stage surrounding, really, they started with 30 by 30, or it's called America the Beautiful, which is the plan put out by the federal government under President Biden and Secretary Deb Haaland, who's the Secretary of the Interior. 30 by 30, and I'm going to cover this to clarify, but let's not dive into national politics. We can do that off screen. But to describe 30 by 30, because it's not a new concept, 30 by 30 initially started as 50 by 50. It was called the half Earth theory, put out by E.O. Wilson, who passed away earlier this year. He was a renowned ecologist and biologist and, conservationist, who really put conservation on people's minds in his day. He was a really very forward thinker of his time. And he said, to appropriately conserve the planet, we need to conserve 50% of it. 50% of the world's land and waters need to be protected in order to maintain this planet and maintain the world that we know it as we know it. That has over the decades, that's been chipped away to say, okay, let's make it a realistic goal of 30 by 30. And that's 30, and in America, that means 30% of America's land and waters being protected by 2030. And that has been put into the mission of America the Beautiful. 30 by 30, there was some misconceptions about it being preservationist. And there's a difference between preservation and conservation. And anyone who catches me out and about on a walk, at the bar, in a bookshop will know that this is one of the hills that I fight on, that conservation and preservation are different. Preservation, preservation is protecting the land and not using it, not utilizing the resources with the future in mind. You think of all of our national parks. National parks are dedicated in preservation. So the Grand Canyon, no mining, no hunting, none of that. Rocky Mountain National Park, we live in Grand County just outside Rocky Mountain National Park, and there's no hunting, there's no use of the natural resources outside of their intrinsic value. Conservation is use of natural resources with the future in mind. So agriculture done in a certain way is conservation because they're utilizing the resources, but in a sustainable and ongoing way so that their kids and their kids' kids and their kids' kids' kids will be able to practice at least a similar method as they're doing today. National Forests, the United States Forest Service, is a conservation organization. Right, National Forest is the land, I think it's the land of many uses. That might be the wrong slogan. But that allows hunting. It does allow mining, it allows logging, it allows use of natural resources, but ideally in a long-term vision sort of way. 30 by 30 doesn't discriminate between the two, which I think has caused some confusion. Conservation easements play into 30 by 30. We conserve land, but we have ranchers, we have homeowners, we have farmers all involved in conservation to allow for this ongoing long-term practice. A few weeks ago, Melissa Daruna, who's the executive director of Keep It Colorado, or the Colorado Coalition of Land Trusts, as it used to be called, published a great essay in the Colorado Sun debunking a few of the myths that surround specifically conservation easements. Because, as I said, easements and land trusts have been wrapped up in the controversy around 30 by 30. So first, I do want to go through, because she has 6 really great points, and I'll go through each one by themselves. And if anyone has questions, like I said, feel free to raise your hand. So first is that conservation, or 30 by 30, excuse me, is a land grab. Private land conservation, as Melissa writes, and as we talk about all the time, private land conservation is voluntary. Conservation easements are voluntary. As not only as a third party, but as a nonprofit, we have no ability of eminent domain. We can't go to a landowner and say, hey, all of your neighbors want you to conserve your land, so we're going to do it. No. I can approach those landowners and say, your property is viable for conservation, it's appealing to conservation, there's public support to conserve it, but until that landowner says yes, there's really nothing we can do. And that does point to the importance of talking with your neighbors and talking with developers and landowners in your area to say, hey, let's try and make this as a win-win-win for everybody. So the neighbors get to win because they have this beautiful open space. The developer or the landowner gets to win because they have the legacy of conservation. And then, of course, nature, right? We have the purposes of conservation easements range from wildlife conservation, water conservation, free-flowing streams, especially here in the Headwaters. We have the Fraser River, we have Willow Creek, we have Williams Fork, we have the Blue, all connecting to the Colorado River. Conservation easements allow for those streams and rivers to continue flowing with such force. Clean air, of course, is a big one, as well as simply scenic and agricultural open space. As we drive down 40, a lot of, conservation easements are still private property, so it's the prerogative of the landowner to allow people onto their property, regardless if it's conserved or not. And when people when people complain about that or ask about that, my general response is, well, when you drive down 40, would you rather be driving between condos and paved parking lots and roads that, yeah, you can access and bike around and walk around? Or would you drive down 40 between open space and ranches and historic landscapes that, yeah, you might not be able to mountain bike on or hike on or hunt on, but at least you have that really nice drive, and the wildlife, the water, and the air are all benefiting. And 9.9 times out of 10, the answer is, oh yeah, I'd rather have the open space. Yeah, so I'll stop there and say, are there any questions about the voluntary nature of conservation easements, the relationship that land trusts have with landowners, or anything along those lines?
I have a question.
Go for it, Freeland.
So between the land trust and the landowners, like, how does a landowner stay engaged with the land trust after the easement's complete? Or what's the protocol after, let's say I got an easement? Do you come out to my place? Like, what do you do? How do you enforce it?
Sure, that's a great question. I'll start at the end. You said, how do we enforce it? And that is accurate. I should have said this earlier, that the land trust responsibility after the easement is signed and in place is to enforce it, is to make sure that the landowner is living up to their end of the deal, just as it is the landowner's responsibility to do the same for the land trust. After the conservation easement is signed, and it is not signed until all negotiations are over, everyone has to be at the table in order to sign that conservation easement. After that, the land trust then monitors, and we go out once a year onto each of the properties physically, meet with the landowner, and then take photo points. And these photo points are all from the same location at the same angle, that then we can create a book of, and in 10 or 15 years, we have 10 or 15 years worth of the same photo to ensure that the property has been conserved and that the property has not been developed. And the joke that I usually say is, when I go out there and I pull up your conservation easement and say, you said that you would not build a Ferris wheel, and I see a Ferris wheel, we're going to have an issue. That usually drives it home for most folks. There are, of course, cases of argument or disagreement down the road, right? No document is 100% ironclad, although we certainly try to accomplish that. And I really encourage communication. I encourage landowners both to come to me, come to our office to talk about whether they have a project in mind or they have a question about something. Most of the time, this happens with landowners who bought property with an easement already on it, but it does happen with the original grantors. And that is communicating with me, or if anyone is here watching from a different service area of a different land trust, communicate with your land trust. That is the best way to avoid any type of conflict. Just get it out in the open, don't be shy. If there is a conflict, and that means a conflict, the way I'm using it is any fuzzy way of violating the conservation easement. Sometimes it is very black and white. Most of the time it's fairly vague to say, right, because conservation is about use of the land and use of the natural resources. Sometimes one person might look at a project and say, yes, that qualifies as conservation. And other times another person might look at it and say, no, it doesn't. And so that is, of course, the primary reason I advocate people calling me and emailing me and coming to the office. But on top of that, if it gets to a point where a conflict is imminent or a conflict has already happened, God forbid, conversations happen, but land trusts are also empowered by both our state and national organizations. So Keep It Colorado here in Colorado, the Land Trust Alliance being national, but then also land trusts are also responsible to various levels of government because we are dealing with real estate, with real property. And if it violates this title document of the conservation easement, at least the IRS might get involved, and that's something, of course, we want to avoid. But land trusts, you go to any type of conference or rally of land trusts and you'll hear stories about cases that land trusts won and cases that land trusts lost because of how someone interpreted the conservation easement. And so it really does come down to communication. That was long-winded, but Quillen, did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Of course. Yes, Paula, go ahead. Can you unmute?
Unmute. Okay.
Okay.
No. Am I muted?
Nope. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm the president of the board of Colorado Headwaters Land Trust. My name is Paula Stewart. And one of the things that came across my email, as some of you or most of you might know, we're accredited by the Land Trust Alliance, which is the national overarching organization to which we're held to some pretty tight standards. And for their 40th anniversary, they asked land trust leaders to share their visions for the future of conservation and the land trust movement. And I just thought I would just read one. This is short. And this is from Emily Warner, who's the executive director of the Cacapon, I might not be saying that right, and Lost Rivers Land Trust in West Virginia. I want a world 40 years from now where streams run clear, mountains capture the imagination, sustainable farms thrive, and children have plentiful occasions to go outside and explore, discover, and wonder. This is why I work to conserve land. Land trusts face many challenges. There is never enough money, time, staff capacity, or information. Climate change looms. Our conservation easement language is never perfect. Development pressure builds. Prioritization of so many important challenges and projects is difficult, yet Our work is too important to allow ourselves to be bogged down by scarcity against the enormity of our task or distracted into ineffectiveness. As we look forward to the next 40 years, I hope the conservation community will focus its intentions with urgency, yes, but also with optimism. To be successful, I believe land trusts must remain unapologetically focused on what we do best, and we must do so with hope. On my office wall, I have tacked the words "Protect Land" with 2 photographs and a map of the Cacapon watershed. The words keep my mission in focus, so I avoid straying down important but not my job paths. The map and mountains and mountainscapes stir my love for this part of the world and encourage me to dream. Whether our missions are to conserve a watershed's forests, protect farmland, save the greater sage grouse, or enhance equity through outdoor recreation, we must keep the focus on our chosen missions. We must let go of the discomfort of what we are not doing and concentrate our passions on moving forward together with hope. I read through quite a few of these, and I thought that one had, just it really rang true to me about what we're trying to do, because the sage grouse is part of what we're trying to protect in Granby. And anyway, so I just offer that out from the Land Trust Alliance.
That was great. Thank you for sharing that, Paula. So there have been a few questions posed in the chat. So I'll start with Tony's. Please discuss the process, particularly the appraised development value versus the conserved appraised value as it pertains to the tax benefit. So something that I didn't mention earlier, but this is a great segue, is there is a financial benefit to having to granting a conservation easement. Colorado has been on the forefront of conservation in the United States for many decades or generations. And in one way, it is because we have state exchangeable tax credits in exchange for conservation easements. So a conservation easement is real property, right? It's dealing with real estate. And so we have to get an appraisal done on the conservation values of the property before we really put a value on the conservation easement, right? We don't know how we're affecting the value of the property until we get that appraisal. A conservation appraisal is a step above a general real estate appraisal. That's for a number of reasons. The main one being that in the early 2000s, there was a lot of conflict around conservation easements and specifically around appraisals. There were some bad actors, but the land trust community and a couple other members joined together in the early 2000s to clean up our own community. And in the last 20 or 30 years, you can really see that was accomplished fairly well. Conservation appraisals are done by only a handful because it takes much more training and much more certification to be a conservation easement appraiser. Maybe, actually, I'll say this now, next year, I hope to have an appraiser on one of these panels. I think that would be a really great conversation. A conservation easement appraisal usually comes in at around 30 to 40% of the full market value or fair market value. So if your property would be appraised, right, you're selling your property on the regular market, it's just real estate, that could be appraised at $1 million. The conservation easement appraisal might come in at, call it $500,000, right, 50%. Frankly, that is on the higher end. Most of our appraisers come in at around 42 to 45%. But for the sake of clean numbers, we'll do 500,000. So that is the value of the conservation easement. And I'll be frank, on paper, it looks like you are devaluing your property, right? When you sell, it looks like you'll only be able to sell the property for 500,000 because the conservation easement was valued at 500,000. Anecdotally, both from myself and from colleagues around the country, that's not true. Most conservation easements, in my experience, and those of my colleagues, have sold for more, or the properties have sold for more than their asking value because they are conserved. In recent years, it really does seem like a lot of people are starting to put their money where their mouths are, to say, I believe in conservation, and I'm going to make sure that I buy a property that is either already conserved or eligible to be conserved. So back to the 500,000, that's the appraised value. In Colorado, with exchangeable state tax credits, you can when you grant the conservation easement, you can apply for exchangeable state tax credits. As of last year, the state legislature and the governor signed a new bill. I don't think I've been, 21-1233, if you want to look it up, House Bill 21-1233, which raised the cap on exchangeable tax credits to 90%. It was hovering much lower for a long time. And we in the land trust community felt like it would be a pretty good benefit to make sure that the landowners benefit as much as they can by conserving their land, as much as everybody else is benefiting from that individual's conservation value. So a landowner can then apply for those exchangeable state tax credits and receive roughly 90% of that $500,000 in tax credits. They can use those tax credits if they'd like, and there are certain caps that are associated with that based on the value, or they can exchange them. They can sell them to another Colorado taxpayer. And then the original landowner gets cash in hand, which is always nice, and the new buyer gets to have these tax credits and use them on their own in their own way. There are some nuances to it, but I repeatedly have, in every conversation I have with either our attorney or our tax credit friends or any other type of accountant, they tend to tell me to stop at a certain point because I'm starting to overreach my own position. And so if anyone would like to learn more about tax credits, I can certainly point you in the right direction, set you up with the right people to talk with, whose job it is to talk about this type of stuff. Tony, that was fairly brief, but did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
So another question that came in through the chat is they want to know about water rights as they pertain to easements. And this is a great question, and of course, very relevant to today's day and where we are here in the Colorado Headwaters. Water rights can be encumbered by conservation easements. They are not granted through the easement. So we have, of our 66 conservation easements, a handful of them encumbered their water rights. The land trust does not hold those water rights. We do not hold those water rights. The landowner still does, but what it means to encumber those water rights is to tie the water to the land. That ensures that the water stays where it's supposed to be. It stays in the Colorado headwaters and or is able to be flowed downstream, as opposed to having any type of transbasin diversion or otherwise remove the water from the watershed where it belongs. Conservation easements are a really great way to accomplish this, especially as water and water rights are really big in the news with the Colorado River Compact 100th anniversary upon us, as well as the ongoing drought and a lot of the other projects and concerns that people have from Colorado all the way down to Baja California. Right, there's 14 million people, I believe, rely on 40 million people rely on the Colorado River. It's quite an important river, and conservation easements and water rights play a big role in conserving that water and maintaining the watershed from here all the way down. That also applies to mineral rights. Grand County doesn't have a whole lot of mineral rights unless you're really into gravel. But if you do hold your own mineral rights and you have an opportunity for a conservation easement, you can also tie those mineral rights to the land as well, instead of severing them. One of the other aspects of Grand County mineral rights is that at least the majority that I have seen, have already been severed, which means that whether it was 50 or 100 years ago, someone had ownership of the land, of the ground itself, and someone else owned the minerals beneath the surface. A lot of times it was based on speculation. That's a conversation for another day. But there are ways to conserve minerals and conserve water with a conservation easement that benefits everybody. Hodor, did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Speaking on behalf of Hodor.
So I'll take a short break and do my little advertisement. Again, we are about part way through Hats Off for Headwaters, which is the Colorado Headwaters Land Trust annual fundraiser. This is our second virtual panel of 3. On Monday, we had a great conversation with Eric Friels, who is the new Sulphur District Ranger here in Arapahoe National Forest. He's new to the area and new to his position here in Arapahoe. We had a really great conversation and a lot of good input. If you missed that one, that is on our website and on our YouTube page, so you can find it there, as well as this recording will be, and then tomorrow's panel will be with certain Colorado Headwaters Land Trust Board and staff, talking about our own paths towards conservation, our own place here at the Land Trust. And that will be also recorded and put on YouTube. This fundraising week ends on Sunday, the 18th, with Hats Off for Headwaters celebration, which is going to be at Casa Vista, a great venue outside of Fraser, from 1 to 4. Tickets are still available, so you can go online or email me directly to learn more about that. This fundraiser, of course, supports the organization, but also supports a project that we've been working on. We're raising money to conserve 780 acres in the town of Granby. The town annexed this property, about 1,300 acres, a few years ago, sold about half of it to a developer, and Sun Communities has been a great boon to Granby, a lot of economic growth and personnel growth. And then the other half of the property, 780 acres and 2 river miles of the Colorado River, are slated to be conserved with Colorado Headwaters Land Trust. And we're in the final steps of raising money to accomplish this. Once it's conserved, about 480 acres of that land will be turned into a public park with multi-use non-motorized trails, as well as other amenities and facilities. And then 300 acres of this property will turn into what I've been calling a wildlife preserve, a no access zone dedicated solely for wildlife, for a number of reasons. The main one being there are fewer and fewer migration corridors to connect the 2 halves of the county. If this property gets developed, those corridors will nearly vanish. And a lot of our charismatic megafauna, elk, moose, deer, handful of others, antelope, can't forget those, they won't necessarily be able to cross from the Byers Canyon and Kremling area to the Continental Divide and the east side of the county. And that is, of course, very dangerous. Anyone who lives in Grand County knows that every town has its own weather system and every segment of the county has its own weather system. And it's really important for wildlife to be able to migrate with the seasons and find their place as they have for many, many centuries or millennia. This property will also benefit, as Paula mentioned, a couple endangered species such as sage grouse, as well as the Colorado River. We are at the headwaters. Protecting this watershed is highly important. As small as Grand County is in population, we certainly hold a big effect from here all the way downstream, affecting people in Phoenix and LA and Tucson and all the way through to Baja California. And so on Sunday at the in-person event, I'll be presenting on this a little bit more, presenting on the project, making a specific pitch. Again, if you would like to learn more, my door is always open, my email is always on, so you're welcome to reach out. So I'm going to hit another myth that Melissa mentioned here. The main one being that the agricultural community is opposed to conservation easements. And as I've said earlier this evening, that's false. If that were true, we wouldn't have any agricultural properties, and roughly a third of the conservation easements held by Colorado Headwaters Land Trust are active agricultural operations, and many more have ag status in one fashion or another, whether it's a forest ag or they lease it to neighbors or something along those lines. Many agricultural organizations support conservation easements. Melissa lists Western Landowners Alliance, Family Farm Alliance, Society for Range Management, American Farmland Trust, Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition, the America, and then she has a quote from the American Farmland Trust. I come from an agricultural background, both small farms as well as large cattle ranches and other crop operations. And conservation was always a major conversation on the operation, whether it was over dinner or in the field, or if an agency, a state or federal agency, was monitoring or had conversations with us about water catchment or endangered species. We all came to the table around conservation. And that is echoed by a lot of the agriculturalists that are part of the land trust community. It is very important for landowners of all stripes to conserve their land And conservation easements give them a huge leg up in that effort. Because while a lot of times when we pitch conservation easements, we pitch them in the moment, right? In the present, to say, would you rather have condos or open space? Right? Or I think it's Montana Land Reliance who says condos or cows. We also look much longer term. Conservation easements are perpetual. They go on forever. And so some of the language that I like to use is that, yes, conservation easements prevent development, but they also prevent the threat of development. So when we think about our children and our children's children, generations on gone, we can take comfort in knowing that, yes, we are making a decision for them, but we are also removing that threat from ever knocking on their door. Because any developer worth their salt will know, but they do their research on the property they want to buy and develop, they'll see a conservation easement and they'll say, oh, it's not even worth knocking on their door because legally I won't be able to develop it. For agriculturalists, that is a huge importance. Agriculture is an industry of heritage. It's an industry of legacy, right? My grandfather started the farm and my grandkids will continue it. And a conservation easement, especially in a world like today, where development is rampant and a lot of money is changing hands very quickly, there are a lot of people who want to hold on to what they have and hold on to their heritage in order to form their legacy. Conservation easements give them a big leg up in that. And while they, of course, have to have a conservation ethic to even start the conversation, there is financial benefit to a conservation easement. And it is not uncommon to have ranchers and farmers consider conservation easements in order to get a little bit of cash to help them through a rough period or to help ease some family debates or family discussions. If a sibling wants to be bought out of the ranch or a cousin doesn't want any part of the farm, a conservation easement can help with that. So we'll take another break if anyone has a question or comment to make. Okay. So we are coming up on about, well, we passed half an hour, about 45 minutes. I think I can tackle another myth, but again, feel free to put comments or questions in the chat or raise your hand or just unmute and say something.
Jeremy, look at who was here. Hey, I've got to run. I've got to go pick up my wife. But very informative, very useful, very helpful. Jeremy, I'm sorry I'm not going to be there
That's all right.
this weekend, but good luck. I put in some bids. I'm losing on everything right now. I'll update you later.
Thank you, Lee.
Good luck.
Thank you.
All right, talk to you later. Bye.
Well, that was a great pitch for the auction. So thank you, Lee, for that. Hold on. Sorry. My papers got screwed up here. So I'll come back to the idea of private property rights. Permanent land protection agreements take away private property rights. That's the myth that Melissa is writing about. Conservation, her response to that is that conservation is the ultimate freedom to exercise private property rights. Landowners work with land trusts or open space agencies to determine the criteria for protecting the conservation values that are important to them. And that echoes a lot of what I've said previously in this conversation of this is a decision to make that is just as heavy or just as long lasting as any other decision one landowner might make about their land, whether that does mean developing it, paving it over, conserving it, keeping it as ag land, dividing it up between children or siblings or neighbors. It is conservation easements allow you to maintain your lands and keep them together. And that is something, right? I know that I'm repeating myself, but a lot of the myths around this and the falsehoods surrounding conservation easements are very basic and very basically argued against. And a lot of the answers that I'm giving here can be applied to them fairly readily. Well, If there aren't any other questions, we can certainly end it. Oh, here we go. This is Doris. I'm curious if any Colorado Headwaters Land Trust easements were affected by the East Troublesome Fire. What is the impact of such catastrophic events? That is a great point. So we had 3 conservation easements directly in the path of the East Troublesome Fire. I guess, yeah. One of the easements, which is actually 5 easements, but it's one ranch, was burned completely over. One easement was spared, thankfully, although for about a week after the fire, we weren't sure because no one could actually get up there, but it was protected. And then the 3rd easement, which I will say, if anyone tuned in, I believe it was in 2020, we had a conversation with Bev, with the Andergrant property, which is one of our easements outside of Grand Lake. That property had a fire line built across it. And that meant that the firefighters went in and they burned part of the property to prevent the fire from continuing on its path. When that happens, there are a couple tracks that a land trust can take. What we did was we consulted with the landowners. We went out there a couple times and said, you know what? This fire and the East Troublesome Fire was unique in more than a handful of ways. The damage that it wrought was not necessarily long lasting, right? It wasn't, you go out there and it no longer looks like a hellscape, pardon, or really just sticks and burned stones just lying all over the place. The land rebounded fairly quickly. If it were more catastrophic ecologically, so we're talking about a flood, a major flood like they see in the Southeast, excuse me, or one of the really destructive and long-lasting fires that we have had here in the area, but a good example would be Northern California, we might be inclined to do a new baseline. So when we grant a conservation, or when we accept a conservation easement, one of the first documents we have to produce is a baseline. And so an ecologist goes out onto the property and says, okay, this is the history of the property, this is the topography of the property, this is the ecology of the property, and that's our baseline. And so every successive year when we go out to monitor the property and take photo points and interview the landowner, that baseline is what we go back to. If something catastrophic happens, whether natural or man-made, and of course a wildfire is, whether it's natural or man-made is debatable. If it is so catastrophic that it physically changes the property, physically changes the land, a new baseline is certainly needed. For the East Troublesome, through our consultants and through a couple colleagues that I talked with, we decided that a baseline was not necessarily necessary. But we are keeping an eye on it and continuing to talk with those landowners. Let's see. Okay, here are some new ones. Oh, wow, a lot of questions coming in now. Are there different types of easements? I remember reading about the affordable housing one. Could be interesting to mention other models people have followed. So there are different types of easements, but they're not all conservation easements. And so what I think you might be referencing is the difference between a land trust and a community land trust, a CLT. A CLT, you'll find it more in urban areas or at least in developing areas. So the Fraser River Valley might produce a community land trust. They don't have one now. Burlington, I believe, Burlington, Vermont has one of the longest standing community land trusts. CLTs were big in the Southeast, mainly to repatriate land to descendants of freed enslaved people, as well as others in more urban areas. And what community land trusts are, I am not an expert, but my understanding is that the community land trust will own the real estate, will own the property of the building, and then they can control what happens to the building, what happens to the development on the land itself. So that is different than what we do. But you can think of a conservation easement in the context of other land easements, like energy easements. I grew up on a farm that had an energy easement across it. We had I believe it was a phone line, and my parents got a check from the phone company every so often for allowing them to have that across their property. Our neighbor had an access easement on his farm for another neighbor, where that third neighbor would pay him to be able to drive across the farm to access his own house. A conservation easement functions in a very similar way, except for instead of allowing an energy line or allowing a driveway, a conservation easement allows for conservation. So disallowing a lot of development. I'm just going to read these in order. So there are a bunch of questions here. What is your advice to a landowner with an easement who wants to convince their neighbors or community to conserve a parcel of land? Are there any best tactics for collaboration? I would start with coffee. Get to know your neighbors, get to know other people in your community, whether you live in Fraser, you live in Winter Park. Go to town meetings, go to community meetings. They don't have to be formal or legal or anything, but just get to know your neighbors to make sure that everyone has very similar conservation values. Sometimes that might take convincing, other times all it will take is simply opening the door and kind of cracking that can to say, oh, I also believe in that. But then also acting as an advocate for conservation, you need to be confident in and of yourself. And so being able to speak directly to wildlife, being able to speak directly to water or open lands or air or any of the aspects of conservation value is very important. In my experience and the experience a lot of my colleagues and peers over the years is if we're able to speak directly from our heart and directly from our experience, that goes much farther than trying to parrot academic articles or statistics or quotes from celebrities or politicians. We are all people and we all kind of, I know this sounds kind of wonky, but we all live together here on this world, on this earth. And 9 times out of 10, we tend to agree. We all like watching the moose. And so what can we do to make sure that not only can we watch the moose tomorrow, but so can all of those future generations. And then best tactics for collaboration. There's a term that I like to use that at least one of my board members laughs at called ground truth. Being able to ground truth something is being able to go out onto the land, in this case, specifically the land, to say, look, now my 2 eyes and your 2 eyes and all of our tactile functions and all of our senses are processing the same information and we're able to really grasp it. We don't have to be reading academic articles. We don't have to be watching YouTube videos. We don't have to be talking to an expert who might be an expert in the field, but in an office in Copenhagen. You and I are on the land looking at this invasive species, or you and I are on the land looking at this herd of moose that was much bigger a decade ago. And so why have the moose cut in half in population? Or I remember growing up to the sound of the sage grouse, out in the prairie. Why don't I hear those anymore? Or I remember when the Colorado River was flowing rapidly all the time. And now it's very rare to see the river flowing with such a steam. Being able to ground truth it and talk to your neighbor about that is the very first step of any type of collaboration. And that is something that I really do advocate. Okay, getting to Marty's questions. Are there any guidelines describing what is generally considered development? For example, are these allowed? A reservoir, unpaved recreation path, solar farm, horse stables, tennis courts? Does the property owner have to specify these as allowable? I would like to be able to give a general answer, but ultimately all of these are case by case. And that is one of the malleable aspects and the beneficial aspects of conservation easements, is that it can be as vague or as specific as the landowner wants, within a certain barrier, right? The land trust does have to have the conservation value there. I will say I will start with tennis courts, probably not, unless it is within a building area. So when you have a conservation easement, say it's 100 acres, of the 100 acres, when you approach me about conserving it, there's no building on it. There's no garage, there's no shed, there's no nothing. And you say, okay, I'm looking forward to building my summer home on this property, or I'm looking forward to building my house on this property and I want to ranch it or something along those lines. You and I can sit down and say, okay, here is a 5-acre area. where building is allowed, or 2 3-acre areas, or any combination thereof. And I'm using these numbers because they're common, but I've seen building areas that are 15 acres big, which would be a push unless the property you're conserving is very, very big. And so within a building area, there are much more allowances for development and for construction that the landowner can have. And Colorado Headwaters Land Trust, I like to consider us to be, we really do respect private property. We have board members who, of course, disagree on a lot of what constitutes conservation, what really makes Grand County so great, or Grand County so grand. Sorry, the pun didn't work there. But ultimately, they all agree that this is a choice of the private property owner, and the end goal is always the same. Going back to collaboration, collaboration requires that common end goal. And so being able to say, this private property owner wants to be able to build a house, we need to allow for that, and we need to benefit that, because ultimately, if we don't allow that landowner to build their house on their property within a building area, within a conservation easement, we might not even get the conservation easement. So tennis courts might be allowed within that building area. Horse stables, unpaved recreation pads, reservoirs are all allowed within those bounds. I will say unpaved recreation paths are probably the most allowed. You likely don't even need that building area to do it. But the language that I would strongly recommend, and a lot of this comes out in the negotiation. I bring these questions to the landowner as well to say, do you want a path? Do you want a path from, wherever your house is going to be down to the creek? And the landowner will say, yeah, it'd be nice to have that path. And so the language I might use in the conservation easement is, the title of the chapter would be trails and walkways, and underneath it is allowed would be the construction of unpaved walkways, maybe some parameters of location, maybe some parameters of distance or length, but really making sure that the landowner can still have a really good time on their own property for many, many years to come. Solar farms are a hot topic. They are getting more and more controversial within the conservation community, because it's the intersection of renewable energy and open space conservation. There are some test cases. There's one in Colorado, I believe, outside of Boulder. There's a few I've heard about in New Mexico, where they're trying to match, or they're trying to intertwine wind farms or solar farms as well as conservation easements. It gets difficult. I think I don't want to speak for the organization because we have not had this conversation yet. And I'll be frank about that, it really hasn't come up quite yet, although these questions are getting more and more common. Our mission at the Colorado Headwaters Land Trust is to conserve and steward open land and natural character of the headwaters of the Colorado River in partnership with the local community. Open land and natural character doesn't include solar farms. It doesn't include wind turbines, right? Because those are not about open space. Those are about energy capture and energy production. That is not to say we will never be for them. That is not to say that we're against them in the moment. We just haven't seen them proposed to us yet. And but it's a delicate topic, and I'm trying to answer it as diplomatically as I can. But it's a hot topic, and it comes up at a lot of land trust meetings with colleagues of mine, as well as across the national stage. And then again, does the property owner have to specify these as allowable, as specific or as general as the land trust and the landowner want it to be? Common language that is used that comes up again at a lot of land trust meetings is commercialization. Most conservation easements will include a line about no commercialization of the land. We like to include examples to say, okay, what does this mean? This means no feedlots, no large industrial facilities, nothing along those lines. Some land trusts, one comes to mind from the Northeast. They had a conflict with this landowner, had a beautiful mansion on their property and a large lawn, and the conservation easement, the building area was very small around the house, when it probably should have been larger, right, to include the lawn. And the landowner wanted to have a wedding, and it was a commercial wedding. It wasn't like a nephew or anything like that. And the land trust was kind of caught. They said, well, technically that's commercialization because you're commercializing the property, but it doesn't necessarily negatively affect the conservation value. And so that's a conversation that I have had with landowners, that a lot of my colleagues have had with landowners. What does this mean? And that is, I think, a perfect case of communication or needing communication. Coming to me, coming to your local land trust or whomever, with whomever you have your conservation easement to say, hey, I have this idea, let's talk about it. If it's a wedding, is it a 5K? Is it you want, you might have ag status, but you want to up your game and kind of enter the cow-calf operation world, so it requires much more land and many more cattle. Have that conversation, and any land trust or land trust director worth their salt will very gladly have that conversation with you, because it is in all of our best interests to achieve conservation and to achieve that type of community conservation and collaboration that benefits everybody in the long run. I hope I answered your questions there. We are running up on an hour, so I'll take these last few minutes, one, to solicit any more questions or comments, but also to reiterate that we are in Hats Off for Headwaters, which is our annual fundraising event. This week, there's an online silent auction on HandBid, and you can find that on our website, coloradoheadwaterslandtrust.org. On Sunday, the 18th, we will have our in-person event at Casa Vista, down outside of Fraser. In this event, you'll meet Land Trust board and staff. You'll meet a lot of neighbors and community members you might not know, all associated with the conservation easement and land trust world. You'll get to support us and eat some delicious local food catered by our neighbor here in Granby. And then I will speak more about the Granby project, the Granby Highlands Trails Conservation Easement, and really, of course, make that push to help fund it. If you want to tune in tomorrow, we will have a panel of a couple land trust board members and staff, and I will facilitate the conversation. It'll be, well, tonight was educational. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about our own paths in conservation, how we got to where we are, why we support the land trust, why we're here in Grand County. It'll be a really good time, especially if you haven't met a lot of our board members or staff members. I believe that's all for this evening. This recording will be on YouTube over the next couple days, as well as the one from Monday, which was a conversation between myself and Eric Friels, who's the new district ranger of the Sulphur Ranger District in Arapahoe National Forest, which is our local national forest here in Grand County. And that was a great conversation. I'm really happy that we were able to make that happen. If there are any other questions, please feel free to reach out. My email is Jeremy, Jeremy, at coloradoheadwaterslandtrust.org. You can call the office 970-887-1177 or visit us online at coloradoheadwaterslandtrust.org. You can also find us Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and YouTube, all CO Headwaters LT. So Colorado Headwaters Land Trust on all of those platforms. And we really thank everybody for joining us this evening for the spiel and conversation about conservation easements and land trusts. There's a lot to know. I barely scratched the surface, but I wanted to make sure that a lot of the basic points were out there just to get people's minds going. And if you do have further questions, reach out. So unless there's anything else, I'll say good evening to everybody, and I look forward to seeing you either online tomorrow and or in person on Sunday. Thank you.